You're sitting at dinner. The bill comes. It's $73. You split it 4 ways, throw down a card, and forget about it by the time you're in the Uber home. 3 months later, you're wondering why you can't afford the thing you actually wanted. This happens to almost everyone, and there's a reason for it. It's not a lack of discipline. It's not because you're bad with money. It's because your brain is wired to ignore a very specific type of financial erosion, the kind that happens in $500 chunks. Let me show you what I mean. The $500 rule isn't something you'll find in a textbook. It doesn't have a Wikipedia page. But if you talk to financial advisors, especially the ones who work with people earning between $60,000 and $150,000 a year, they'll all tell you the same thing. There's a spending threshold where money becomes invisible. It sits right around $500. Below that amount, people tend to justify purchases without much friction. A $200 dinner? Special occasion. A $350 concert ticket? You deserve it. A $450 flight you didn't plan for? It's fine, you'll make it work. Above $2,000 or $3,000, people pause. They think. They budget. They might even lose sleep over it. But between $100 and $500, something strange happens. The purchase feels significant enough to not be trivial, but not large enough to trigger real financial fear, so it gets filed under reasonable. And that's where the trap is. Because $500 spent 12 times a year is $6,000. Spent once a month, it's still $6,000. But it never feels like $6,000. It feels like a bunch of disconnected decisions that made sense at the time. Here's the uncomfortable part. Most people can recall the last major purchase they made over $1,000. They remember the couch, the laptop, the vacation. But if you ask them to list every $500-ish transaction from the last 6 months, they'll get maybe half of them, maybe. There's a reason for that. It's called mental accounting, a concept studied by behavioral economist Richard Thaler. Your brain doesn't treat money as one big pool. It divides spending into categories and judges each one separately. The problem is, those categories are often imaginary, and the thresholds are arbitrary. A $500 expense doesn't feel like it's pulling from the same budget as rent or groceries. It feels like a different type of money, discretionary, flexible, available. But your bank account doesn't see it that way. Let's run a real scenario. You're making $80,000 a year. After taxes, that's roughly $5,000 a month take-home, depending on your state. Your rent is $1,600, your car payment, insurance, utilities, and groceries bring you to about $3,200 total. That leaves $1,800. Now, let's add the $500 range purchases that don't feel like budget killers. A weekend trip, a birthday dinner you planned, a new pair of work shoes that you'd been putting off, a last-minute concert, an overdue car repair that wasn't quite an emergency, maybe a subscription service you upgraded, or a fancy meal you didn't cook because it was a long week. 6 transactions, $3,000, and suddenly you're $1,200 in the hole. You didn't buy anything outrageous. You didn't go on a spree. You made 6 decisions that felt reasonable in the moment, and now you're carrying a balance. Here's where it gets worse. Most people don't track these purchases in real time. They check their account at the end of the month and feel surprised, confused even, because no single transaction feels like the culprit. So they blame the system, inflation, the cost of living, bad luck. And sure, those are real factors, but the missing variable is the thing they're not seeing, the slow accumulation of mid-range purchases that never got added up in their head. This is why credit card companies love the $500 range. It's high enough to generate interest, but not high enough to make people panic. It's the sweet spot of consumer debt, comfortable, frictionless, forgettable. Let's contrast this with how people treat $50 purchases. A $50 brunch? No one's going into debt over that. It's small enough to be impulsive, but it's also small enough that people do it often, and they know they do it often. There's awareness. On the other end, a $5,000 purchase demands a plan. You save for it, you research, You might even talk to someone before you commit. It has weight. But $500? It floats in between. Too big to be casual, too small to be scary, just right to be ignored. And when you multiply ignored decisions, you get a spending pattern that quietly undoes months of careful budgeting. There's a psychological term for this: purchase justification bias. It's the mechanism your brain uses to retroactively defend financial decisions. Once the money's spent, your mind builds a case for why it was necessary. You'll convince yourself it wasn't frivolous, that it had value, that you would have regretted not doing it. And maybe that's true, but the brain doesn't weigh that decision against the 15 other justified purchases that same quarter. It evaluates each one in isolation. That's the flaw, not the individual decision, the failure to see the pattern. Now here's the twist. The $500 rule doesn't affect everyone equally. If you're making $40,000 a year, $500 is a big deal. You feel it. You budget around it. If you're making $300,000, $500 is noise. You can absorb it without consequence. But if you're in that middle band, somewhere between $60,000 and $120,000, you're in the danger zone. You make enough that $500 doesn't feel reckless, but not enough that it doesn't matter. You're in the earnings range where lifestyle inflation starts to kick in, but your margin for error is still thin. And that's exactly where this rule does the most damage. Let me give you a real example. Sarah is 34. She's a project manager making $95,000 a year. She's got her rent under control, she's contributing to her 401k, she even has a savings account. But every few months, she notices the savings account hasn't grown. Sometimes it's even gone down a little. She's not overspending on groceries, she's not buying luxury items, but she is doing things like replacing her laptop when it starts slowing down, booking a weekend Airbnb when she needs a break, buying a new mattress because her back's been hurting, going to a wedding in another city. None of these are reckless, none of them are avoidable, but each one costs around $500, and none of them were in the budget. By the end of the year, she spent $6,000 more than she thought she did, and she has no idea where it went. Here's the really tricky part. The $500 rule doesn't just apply to spending. It applies to under-earning, too. A freelancer might skip pitching a project that would pay $400 because it doesn't feel worth the effort. A side gig that brings in $500 a month gets ignored because it seems too small to matter. But 12 months of $500 is another $6,000 you didn't make. The threshold works both ways. It's the zone where money becomes psychologically invisible, and invisibility leads to inaction. So what do you do about it? The traditional advice is to track everything, build a spreadsheet, use an app, categorize your spending. And sure, that works if you actually do it, but most people don't because tracking is tedious, and the moment it feels like work, it stops happening. There's a simpler approach. It's not about tracking every dollar. It's about becoming aware of the $500 range specifically. That's the zone to watch. That's where the leaks are. One method is to set a monthly cap on mid-range purchases. Let's say 3 per month. Anything between $200 and $700 counts as one. When you hit 3, you stop. No exceptions, no rollovers. It forces you to prioritize. It makes the invisible visible, and it prevents the slow bleed that kills budgets. Another approach is the 48-hour rule for anything over $300. You don't buy it immediately. You wait 2 days. If you still want it, fine, but you'd be surprised how often that urgency fades. The justification that felt bulletproof on Tuesday feels flimsy by Thursday. It's not about deprivation, it's about removing impulse from the equation, because most $500 purchases aren't planned, they're reactive. Here's the bigger picture. The $500 rule is a symptom of something larger. It's about how we perceive value in real time versus over time. We're very good at evaluating individual moments. We're terrible at seeing the cumulative effect. And in a financial system designed to keep you spending, that's a dangerous blind spot. Credit cards don't show you annual totals by default. Retailers don't remind you how many $500 purchases you've made this year. The entire infrastructure is built to make each transaction feel isolated, independent, justified. But your financial health isn't built on individual transactions. It's built on patterns. And if the pattern is 12 invisible $500 purchases a year, you're not building wealth, you're treading water. So here's the question you should be asking. Not, can I afford this, but how many of these have I already said yes to? Because the first one always makes sense. It's the eighth one that breaks you, and you never see it coming.